After someone survives a narcissistic relationship, something subtle but extremely powerful happens inside their mind and body. It doesn't just end as a memory, it becomes a conditioning experience. The nervous system doesn't simply move on, it learns. And what it learns is not always accurate, but it is always adaptive. It learns how to survive intensity. When you look closely at what people call love, after that kind of experience, it often isn't love in its cleanest form anymore. It becomes something closer to emotional pattern recognition. The survivor has lived through cycles of idealization and devaluation, moments of being deeply wanted, followed by moments of emotional withdrawal, confusion, or even psychological punishment. That cycle creates a very specific internal rhythm. High emotional peaks followed by sudden drops, connection followed by absence, warmth followed by unpredictability. Over time, the brain doesn't just remember the person, it remembers the pattern, and this is where the confusion begins. Because the nervous system is not designed to ask, is this healthy? It is designed to ask, is this familiar? Familiarity becomes a survival signal. And when something has been repeated long enough under emotional pressure, it stops feeling like dysfunction and starts feeling like normality thens. So when the relationship ends, the survivor is often left in a strange emotional state. On the surface, there may be relief. No more chaos, no more emotional guessing games, no more walking on eggshells. But underneath that relief, there is often restlessness, a kind of emotional silence that feels unfamiliar. And the mind, trying to make sense of that silence, starts interpreting it incorrectly. It starts to believe that intensity equals connection, and calm equals absence. This is where the first major distortion forms when they eventually meet someone who is not both chaotic, someone who does not swing between extremes, someone who does not flood them with emotional highs and lows. The nervous system doesn't immediately recognize it as safety. Instead, it can register it as emptiness. Because what they are used to is not consistency, it is stimulation. Their definition of connection has been shaped by activation, not stability. And so a very interesting psychological shift takes place. The absence of emotional volatility is no longer experienced as peace. It is experienced as something missing. And the mind, always trying to resolve discomfort, begins to search for explanations. Maybe they are not interested. Maybe something is wrong. Maybe I'm not being valued. But in many cases, what is actually happening is much simpler. The body is detoxing from intensity. This is why survivors of narcissistic relationships can sometimes feel unexpectedly drawn to avoidant partners. Not because avoidants recreate the same chaos, but because they remove a portion of it. They offer distance instead of unpredictability, silence instead of emotional chaos, predictable withdrawal instead of emotional manipulation, and to a nervous system that has been trained in volatility. That reduction in chaos can feel like safety. But here is the deeper layer. What feels like safety is often just the absence of threat, not the presence of connection. And the nervous system, in its early healing phase, struggles to tell the difference. This is the invisible trap. The survivor is no longer reacting to the present moment clearly. They are reacting through a filter built from the past. So they begin to associate emotional stillness with emotional lack. And without realizing it, they start to mistrust healthy consistency because it does not match their internal template of love. What makes this even more complex is that the nervous system is always seeking balance. After prolonged stress, it doesn't immediately move into calm. It often oscillates. So when it encounters someone emotionally unavailable, but not abusive, it can interpret that as safer because at least it is predictable. At least it doesn't spike anxiety in the same way there. And this is the beginning of a very quiet but powerful mistake. Mistaking emotional neutrality for emotional safety, and mistaking emotional absence for emotional peace. The truth is, nothing is more disorienting than learning to unlearn what once felt like love, because the body resists that shift. It resists calm when it has been trained for chaos. It resists consistency when it has been trained for unpredictability, and it resists emotional availability when it has been trained to chase emotional withdrawal. So the survivor is not just healing from a relationship. They are recalibrating their entire internal definition of connection. And until that recalibration happens consciously, they will continue to feel pulled toward dynamics that feel familiar rather than fulfilling, intense rather than stable, or distant rather than genuinely connected again. The real turning point begins when they finally recognize this distinction, that what feels familiar is not always what is healthy, and what feels calm is not always what is empty gunsa. Because once that truth lands deeply enough, the entire pattern begins to lose its power, and for the first time, they are no longer choosing from survival, they are choosing from awareness. What makes this pattern even more difficult to recognize is that the human mind is constantly trying to build coherence out of emotional experience. It doesn't just ask, what is happening? It asks, what does this remind me of? And after a narcissistic relationship, that question becomes the dominant filter through which everything else is interpreted. Because in that kind of dynamic, the survivor has spent a long time adapting to inconsistency. They've learned how to read between emotional lines, how to predict shifts in mood, how to sense distance before it fully appears. That level of emotional vigilance becomes a skill, but it also becomes a trap. It sharpens perception, but distorts interpretation more. So when they leave that environment, they don't leave the skill behind. They carry it forward. And now, instead of being used for survival inside chaos, it gets used to evaluate new relationships. The problem is, the metric has been trained in dysfunction, so normal starts to feel unclear. Even suspicious marred. This is where emotional familiarity becomes dangerously powerful. When they meet someone avoidant, what stands out immediately is not intensity, but predictability. The avoidant partner is often consistent in one thing, emotional distance. They don't oscillate in the same chaotic way a narcissistic partner might. They don't flood the relationship with extremes of affection, followed by punishment or withdrawal cycles. Instead, they maintain space. They regulate through distance. They create boundaries that feel fixed rather than fluctuating mine. And to a nervous system that has been conditioned by unpredictability, that consistency, even if it's distance, feels strangely stabilizing. But here's where the distortion begins. The mind does not always distinguish between emotional safety and emotional familiarity. It assumes that what predict must be what it can trust. And so the absence of volatility becomes misread as the presence of stability. The survivor often experiences this as a subtle internal contradiction. On one hand, there is less anxiety, less emotional chaos, less fear of sudden emotional collapse. On the other hand, there is a growing sense of uncertainty. Why do I feel like something is missing? And instead of questioning the conditioning behind that feeling, they begin to question the relationship itself. This is the hidden mechanism of repetition, not because the avoidant partner is the same as the narcissistic one, but because the emotional template being used to interpret them has not changed in as well. In a narcissistic dynamic, attention often comes in waves, intense engagement followed by withdrawal. That creates a psychological loop of anticipation and relief. The brain gets used to chasing clarity. It gets used to decoding emotional signals that are inconsistent. So when it encounters someone who is emotionally steady in their distance, it does something very human. It tries to map old meaning onto new behavior. The avoidant partner is not chaotic in the same way, but their emotional availability is still inconsistent in terms of closeness. They may be present, but not fully reachable. They may care, but not consistently express it. They may value connection, but still retreat when intimacy deepens. And to someone coming out of narcissistic chaos, this doesn't feel like dysfunction. It feels like a quieter version of what they already know how to navigate. So the nervous system says, something very subtle but powerful. I understand this language. And that sense of understanding becomes mistaken for compatibility. But understanding a pattern is not the same as being nourished by it. This is the deeper psychological confusion. Emotional familiarity feels like recognition, and recognition feels like connection. But recognition is not intimacy. It is memory. It is repetition. It is the brain encountering something it has already learned how to survive. So what begins as calm quickly becomes reinterpretation. The survivor may initially feel relief in the absence of chaos, but over time, that relief can turn into questioning. And that questioning often gets projected outward instead of inward. Are they distant? Are they emotionally unavailable? Do they actually care? But underneath those questions is a much deeper one that is rarely asked. Why does calm feel unfamiliar to me? Because emotional familiarity is not neutral. It carries history. It carries conditioning. It carries the imprint of what the nervous system had to adapt to in order to survive. And until that imprint is consciously examined, it continues to shape attraction, interpretation, and attachment without permission. So the survivor is not simply choosing partners. They are interpreting emotional reality through an old survival map. And that map will always prioritize what feels known over what feels healthy, until awareness interrupts it. The real shift begins when they realize that familiarity is not evidence of truth, it is an evidence of repetition. And repetition, no matter how convincing, is not the same as alignment, because once that distinction becomes clear, the entire way they experience connection starts to change, and for the first time, they are no longer mistaking recognition for love, but beginning to recognize what love actually feels like when it is no longer filtered through the past. What most people underestimate is that emotional experience doesn't just live in the mind, it lives in the body. Long after a narcissistic relationship ends, the nervous system doesn't simply move on, because it was never just dealing with ideas. It was dealing with survival states. It was dealing with adrenaline spikes, cortisol cycles, hypervigilance, emotional anticipation, and sudden drops in connection that trained the entire physiology to stay alert managed. And here's where the deeper problem begins. The body adapts faster than the mind understands. After enough time in that kind of emotional environment, the nervous system begins to normalize intensity, not because it is healthy, but because it becomes familiar. The body learns a rhythm of activation. It learns that love is not calm presence. It is anticipation. It is waiting. It is scanning. It is trying to predict the next emotional shift before it happens. So when the relationship ends, the mind may say, "This is over." But the body doesn't immediately agree. It stays in a state of readiness. It stays tuned to emotional frequency that no longer exists. And that creates a very specific internal experience. Restlessness and stillness. This is why so many survivors describe feeling off, even after leaving the toxic relationship. Not because they want to go back consciously, but because their system has not yet learned how to exist without emotional turbulence. The silence feels too loud. The calm feels too empty. The absence of chaos doesn't immediately register as peace. It registers as unfamiliarity, and this is where the confusion becomes dangerous. When a survivor enters a relationship with an avoidant partner, something subtle but powerful happens. The emotional intensity drops significantly. There are fewer dramatic shifts, fewer emotional highs and lows, fewer moments of psychological activation. On the surface, this looks like relief, and in many ways it is relief. But for a nervous system that has been conditioned through intensity, that relief can feel like something is missing rather than something is healing. So instead of interpreting this calm as safety, the body often interprets it as disconnection. It begins to ask silent questions through sensation rather than logic. Why don't I feel as much? Why is this not as consuming? Why is there no emotional urgency? But these are not intellectual questions. They are physiological echoes of a system that has learned to associate activation with attachment, because in the narcissistic dynamic, emotional intensity was often the glue. The highs created attachment, and the lows created longing. That cycle produces a biochemical loop in the brain that becomes deeply reinforcing. Dopamine spikes during reconciliation, adrenaline during conflict, and emotional relief during brief moments of connection all combine to create what feels like chemistry, but is actually a regulated stress cycle. So when that cycle is no longer present, the body experiences withdrawal, not just from a person, but from a neurochemical pattern. And withdrawal is often mistaken for emotional truth. The survivor doesn't say, "My nervous system is adjusting." They say something feels off. And the mind, always trying to create meaning, begins to fill in the gap. It starts interpreting the lack of intensity as lack of love. It starts interpreting emotional steadiness as emotional absence. And it starts questioning whether this new dynamic is enough, even if it is objectively healthier. Saying this is the invisible trap of recalibration. The body is healing, but the mind interprets healing as loss. Now, when an avoidant partner enters this space, their emotional style can unintentionally reinforce this confusion. Avoidant individuals often regulate closeness through distance. They may be present but not fully emotionally engaged in a consistent way. They may offer connection, but in controlled doses. And while this is very different from narcissistic volatility, it still lacks the emotional immersion that the survivors of its nervous system once associated with bonding products. So the body responds in a very predictable way. It starts searching for activation, not because the relationship is necessarily wrong, but because the nervous system is still calibrated to equate activation with connection. And when that activation is missing, it creates a false interpretation. I don't feel enough. Therefore, this must not be right. But what is actually happening is far more physiological than emotional. The system is detoxing from overstimulation. It is learning, slowly and uncomfortably, that safety does not produce adrenaline, that consistency does not produce spikes, that healthy connection does not require emotional crisis to feel real knowing. And this is where the real internal conflict emerges. The mind wants certainty. The body wants familiarity. But neither of them yet understands safety, Howard. So the survivor stands in a strange transitional space, no longer in chaos, but not yet comfortable in calm. No longer chasing intensity, but not yet trusting peace. And in that space, the old programming tries to pull them back toward what feels alive, even if what felt alive was actually stress. This is why so many people repeat the cycle without realizing it. Not because they want pain, but because their nervous system has not yet learned that stability can also be emotionally fulfilling that. The breakthrough begins when they recognize a simple but profound truth. Intensity is not intimacy, and activation is not love denasiyuvmak. Because once the body learns that calm is not emptiness, but regulation, the entire definition of connection begins to shift. And in that shift, survival stops leading the way, and awareness finally takes its place. And that is the moment everything changes internally, even before anything changes externally. After someone comes out of a narcissistic relationship, their internal definition of danger becomes extremely refined, not always accurate, but refined. They can sense emotional volatility quickly. They can detect manipulation patterns. They can feel inconsistency in ways they didn't before. But there is a hidden side effect to this heightened sensitivity. It doesn't just help them avoid danger. It also distorts their perception of safety. 5. So when an avoidant partner enters their life, something interesting happens. On the surface, this dynamic feels different, quieter, less chaotic, less emotionally explosive. There are fewer arguments that escalate into emotional storms, fewer moments of psychological confusion, fewer intense cycles of idealization and devaluation. And compared to what they survived, this feels like stability. But stability is not always the same thing as emotional presence. Avoidant individuals often regulate closeness by creating space. Not necessarily out of cruelty or manipulation, but out of their own attachment wiring. They tend to value independence, self-containment, and emotional self-sufficiency. When intimacy increases, their instinct is often to step back rather than move closer. And from a purely behavioral standpoint, this creates a predictable pattern distance when things get emotionally intense. For someone coming out of narcissistic chaos, predictability can feel like peace. Because after long periods of emotional unpredictability, the nervous system craves something it can understand. So even if that predictability comes in the form of emotional distance, it still feels less threatening than emotional volatility, and this is where the confusion begins. The survivor's nervous system is no longer asking, is this healthy? It is asking, is this familiar enough to feel safe? And avoidant behavior, while emotionally limited, is often consistent. That consistency can create a subtle sense of relief. There are no dramatic swings, no sudden emotional explosions, no psychological games that constantly destabilize the ground beneath them. So the mind starts interpreting this experience as calm, as grounded, as stable. But here's the critical distinction that often gets missed. Absence of chaos is not the same as presence of connection. Avoidant partners may be calm, but they are often not fully emotionally available in the way secure connection requires. They may care deeply, but struggle to express it consistently. They may value the relationship, but resist emotional closeness when it increases. And this creates a very specific emotional experience for the survivor. They are not being destabilized, but they are also not being fully met to be out. And yet, because the contrast with their past is so strong, this difference doesn't immediately register as a problem. It registers as relief. The nervous system says, At least I am not in pain. But what it does not yet recognize is that it is also not fully in connection. This is where emotional familiarity quietly overrides emotional reality. The survivor is not reacting to what is happening in the present moment alone. They are also reacting to what is no longer happening. There is no manipulation, no emotional punishment, no extreme highs and lows. And in the absence of those extremes, the system mislabels neutrality as safety modes. But emotional neutrality can be misleading, because what feels like peace after chaos is often just emotional quietness, not emotional nourishment. Over time, this can create a subtle internal split. On one hand, there is appreciation for the calm. On the other hand, there is a growing sense of emotional dissatisfaction that is difficult to articulate. Not because something is overtly wrong, but because something essential feels incomplete, Matt. Instead of recognizing that this feeling might be pointing to emotional unavailability, the mind often turns inward. It begins to question the self rather than the dynamic. Why am I not feeling enough? Why do I still feel distant, even when things are fine? Why do I keep wanting more place? But these questions are often misdirected, because the real issue is not that the survivor is incapable of feeling connection. It is that their nervous system is still adjusting to a completely different definition of what connection is supposed to feel like. Avoidant dynamics, especially after narcissistic ones, can create a very subtle illusion that less chaos automatically equals more love. But love is not measured by the absence of conflict alone. It is measured by emotional accessibility, responsiveness, and the capacity to move toward intimacy rather than away from it. And this is the hidden lesson most survivors have not yet integrated. Not all calm is connection, and not all distance is safety-willed. Because once emotional chaos is no longer the reference point, the real work begins, learning to recognize what healthy emotional availability actually sails, like without comparing it to survival. And that requires a completely new internal calibration first. The shift happens when they stop, choosing based on what feels less harmful, and start recognizing what actually feels emotionally reciprocal. Because real safety is not just the absence of chaos. It is the presence of someone who can stay emotionally close without disappearing when connection deepens or true. And that is where true healing begins. Not in escape from pain, but in the ability to finally recognize the difference between distance that protects you and distance that quietly keeps you alone. What makes these patterns so persistent is that they are not just relational, they are psychological imprints. When someone survives a narcissistic dynamic, they don't just walk away with memories. They walk away with a belief system about love, worth, and effort. And one of the most common internal conclusions is subtle but powerful. I have to earn love. That belief rarely announces itself loudly. It operates quietly in the background. It shapes attraction, tolerance, patience, and interpretation. It influences what feels acceptable and what feels normal. And most importantly, it determines what kind of emotional effort feels familiar enough to mainstay in subvertation. So when the survivor leaves a narcissistic relationship, they are not leaving the belief behind. They are often still carrying it into the next chapter of their emotional life. This is where repetition begins, not as fate, but as unconscious design. Because the mind does something very consistent. It seeks resolution for unfinished emotional experiences. If love was once associated with chasing, proving, adapting, and overfunctioning, then the nervous system doesn't immediately discard that equation. It looks for a new environment where that same equation can continue, but in a slightly different form as And this is where avoidant attachment becomes the next stage of the cycle. Avoidant partners do not typically demand love in the overt, controlling way a narcissistic partner might. They don't usually manipulate through extremes or emotional punishment. Instead, they withdraw. They create distance. They offer limited emotional access, especially when intimacy deepens. And while this is structurally different from narcissistic behavior, it produces a very similar internal effect in the other person, a sense of needing to bridge the gap. And this is where the old belief quietly activates again. I have to earn closeness. I have to do something to bring them back in. If I am enough, they will open up. The survivor often doesn't consciously think these sentences, but they feel them. They live them through behavior, through overthinking, through emotional adjustment, through self-doubt that arises every time connection becomes uncertain come Lex. So what looks like a new relationship is often the same emotional script playing in a quieter room. The narcissistic dynamic taught them that love is conditional on performance, on being interesting enough, agreeable enough, valuable enough to maintain attention. The avoidant dynamic reinforces a softer version of the same lesson. Love is conditional on proximity management, on being patient enough, understanding enough, not needing too much, not asking for too much patience. In both cases, the core emotional experience is the same. Love must be earned through adaptation. And this is why repetition is so powerful. Because the external form changes, but the internal instruction remains identical. The survivor is no longer fighting for attention in a chaotic environment. Instead, they are subtly trying to close emotional distance in a restrained one. But the underlying psychological movement is the same. Pursuit, and pursuit always creates imbalance. One person moves forward emotionally, while the other maintains distance. One person invests more energy into connection, while the other regulates through withdrawal. And instead of recognizing this as incompatibility, the survivor often interprets it as a challenge to be solved internally. If I can just be more understanding, if I can just communicate better, if I can just be patient enough, wrote. But what is really happening is not growth. It is repetition of a familiar emotional strategy, earning connection through self-adjustment. This is why the cycle feels so hard to break, because it is not just about choosing different partners. It is about dismantling an internal identity that was built inside emotional inconsistency, an identity that learned to equate love with effort, and effort with self-sacrifice and others. And until that identity is consciously challenged, it will keep recreating environments where effort feels necessary just to maintain emotional closeness. The real shift begins when the survivor realizes something uncomfortable but liberating. If love requires constant earning, it is not love in its healthiest form. It is conditioning, replaying itself, because secure connection does not require pursuit. It does not require emotional overfunctioning. It does not require one person to shrink their needs in order to maintain the bond it allows closeness to exist without negotiation. It allows consistency without performance. And it allows presence without chasing. And this is the turning point most people miss for years. They are not just trying to find a better partner. They are trying to unlearn a version of themselves that believes love must be chased to be real. Once that realization lands, the entire pattern starts to lose its authority, not because relationships suddenly become easy, but because the internal need to earn what should already be mutual begins to dissolve. And in that dissolution, something fundamental shifts. For the first time, connection is no longer a test of worth, but a space where worth is no longer under question worthings. And that is where the cycle finally begins to end. At the deepest level, what keeps this entire cycle alive is not the partner, not even the relationship pattern itself. It is calibration, or more accurately, the lack of it. After a narcissistic relationship, the internal emotional compass that once guided attraction, trust, and safety becomes distorted. Not destroyed, but misaligned. It still functions, but it is no longer accurately reading emotional reality. It is still reacting, still sensing, still interpreting, but through a lens that was shaped in survival rather than stability. So when survivors move into new relationships, especially with avoidant partners, they are not entering with a neutral system. They are entering with a system that has been trained under emotional extremes, under unpredictability, under intermittent reinforcement, under moments where love felt intense but unstable, and safety felt conditional stable. And this is why the sixth layer is so important. Without recalibration, there is no real clarity in choice, because what happens is subtle. The survivor begins to rely on intensity as a reference point. If something feels strong, it feels meaningful. If something feels calm, it feels questionable. If something feels uncertain, it feels familiar. And if something feels steady, it can feel suspicious. So the internal compass flips. Instead of asking, is this emotionally healthy? The system starts asking, do I feel enough activation to validate this connection self? And that question alone changes everything. This is where avoidant dynamics become especially misleading, because avoidant relationships often operate in a low-intensity emotional range. There is less chaos, but also less emotional signaling. less dramatic connection, but also less emotional reassurance. And for someone whose system is still calibrated to equate emotional activation with emotional truth, this can create confusion. They are no longer in danger, but they are not yet in alignment either. And the nervous system, in that in-between space, does what it has always done. It tries to interpret based on familiarity, not accuracy. So, the survivor might find themselves asking questions that seem rational on the surface, but are actually rooted in dysregulation underneath. Why don't I feel as excited? Why does it feel like something is missing? Why am I not as emotionally engaged as before? But these questions are often not about the relationship itself. They are about the absence of old emotional chaos, Bruce. Because when your nervous system has been conditioned by inconsistency, consistency does not immediately register as comfort. It registers as unfamiliar terrain. And unfamiliarity, to a system built in survival, often translates into doubt. This is why people can walk away from toxic relationships and still feel emotionally pulled toward them or toward dynamics that resemble them. Not because they logically believe it was good for them, but because their internal calibration still associates intensity with connection, and avoidant relationships, while not toxic in the same way, can still activate that unresolved calibration gap. Because they often sit in a space of emotional ambiguity, neither deeply engaging nor overtly harmful, present but not fully emotionally reachable, close but not consistently accessible. And that ambiguity keeps the internal system searching for resolution, but there is no resolution in a miscalibrated system. Only repetition. This is why so many survivors feel stuck in cycles that look different on the outside but feel similar on the inside. The external personalities change. The emotional texture softens. The conflicts may decrease, but the internal experience of not quite enough remains, because the measuring instrument itself has not been reset internet. And this is where real healing begins, not in choosing better people first, but in recalibrating the internal reference for what love feels like when it is not filtered through survival. That recalibration is not intellectual alone. It is experiential. It requires the nervous system to slowly learn that calm is not emptiness, that consistency is not boredom, and that emotional safety does not require constant activation to be real and oger. It is the process of unlearning the idea that love must feel like a problem to solve, because when the calibration finally begins to shift, something remarkable happens. Emotional neutrality is no longer interpreted as disconnection. Distance is no longer automatically read as rejection, and stability is no longer confused with lack of feeling. Instead, the system begins to recognize something it was never taught to value: the quiet presence of emotional consistency that does not demand pursuit, performance, or psychological decoding severed. And in that recognition, the entire relational world reorganizes itself. Not because partners instantly change, but because perception finally does. And that is the real endpoint of this pattern. Not finding someone who feels different, but finally becoming someone who can accurately feel what is already healthy. Because once your internal calibration aligns with emotional reality, you stop chasing what activates you and start recognizing what actually sustains you. And that is the moment the cycle doesn't just weaken, it loses its authority completely.